The Shining is a book that needs no introduction, but as a person who writes essays for, at the moment, a living, I feel like there has to be some kind of introduction, or else I don't really know what to say. Published by Stephen King in 1977, when King was 30 years old, damn, I gotta get on with my life, The Shining went on to become one of the most well-known stories of all time. By 1980, it had been adapted into a movie by the late and great Stanley Kubrick, although to say he put his own spin on it is to understate the scope of his rewrites. I say a spin to the same magnitude as accidentally locking your cat in the tumble dryer, but that's why you do a cat check whenever you're about to put a load on, Stan. This ain't my first rodeo. Sorry to the 0.8% of my audience that are over 65 years old, but The Shining suffers from old movie syndrome, where the twists and turns of the story are baked into pop culture. Here's Johnny has been referenced to hell and back, like that whole Luke, I am your father scene, which probably hit crazy hard back in 1840, or whenever Star Wars was released. The only way to have a kid grow up and be able to see it fresh is going to mean showing them it so young that they haven't had a chance to encounter the twist in the wild, which is basically grooming. Despite King's hatred of the Shining movie being a secret so open you could rank it goatsy, it was impossible for Kubrick, a man with an excellent relationship with his father, to be able to take the same sympathetic stance on Jack Daniel Torrance as Stephen King, whose relationship with his absent father haunted him for decades. To King, any father was better than no father. Jack Torrance is a young father employed at the Overlook Hotel as the upcoming winter caretaker, a role requiring him and his family to spend several months of the year on top of a mountain in Colorado, isolated by raging blizzards that prevent any traffic to and from said hotel. The roads are closed, the phone lines are down, and their janky old radio will be the only thing connecting them to the outside world. Jack takes this job 14 months into a shaky sobriety with the warning, hey, no pressure, but the previous caretaker Delbert Grady was a drunk who went mad and murdered his whole family and then himself. Jack's a man who is insecure about three things: his ability to provide, his ability to be sober, and his ability to be clever. I'll be fine, he insists. Only stupid men commit murder-suicides, since there's nothing for them to do all day besides be nagged at by the wife and bitched at by the kids. I'm built different. And as we learn, he was not built different. Alcohol and small towns are a frequent motif in King's writing. King remarked that in a city there are hundreds or even thousands of drunks. In a small town, you only have one. It was just a throwaway comment, but a lot of King's more interesting statements tend to be his throwaway comments, because it tells us two things about Stephen King. One, it suggests that he sees the town drunk as much of a societal role as the local restaurant owner or bus driver or dog walker. And two, King's throwaway metaphors tend to boil down to comparing things to an alcoholic and comparing things to a prostitute. When Steve's university faculty left out some bulky paper that no one else would use, free for the taking, King recalled how he eagerly poured at it like an alcoholic contemplating a case of Chivas Regal. When recalling how he bought a house down the road from the Red Sox training ground, he said, "I'm not going to say that we moved down here the way alcoholics move into bar rooms, but there might have been an element of that involved. Even when the metaphor is so awkward that it has to be taken with water before it will go down smooth, it will still be about alcohol." And if we're going to discuss The Shining, we need to understand why that is so important. What's up, my Stephen Kings and Queens? Looking for an easy last-minute Christmas gift this holiday season? Allow me to recommend Raycon, specifically the Raycon Essential Open Earbuds, which sit just outside of the ear canal to deliver clear sound whilst allowing you to stay aware of your surroundings. I use Raycon for the gym, for travelling, and for running errands. With 8 hours of playtime and 36 hours of battery life, I have never ever had them run dry on battery. They've never fallen out of my ears, they're really comfortable in my ear, and they switch seamlessly between my phone and my laptop. Plus, being outside with them so much, the open ear design allows me to listen out for cars without needing to lower the volume of my music. Win-win. I've been using Raycon myself for years now, actually. Here are the earbuds I asked for 2 Christmases ago, which have also been really good. The battery life is still well over 8 hours, I drop them all the time and they've never so much as cracked, and the noise quality is great. The Essential Open Earbuds are 10 times better and I genuinely recommend them. This is a sponsor I've wanted to work with for a while. They're good quality, affordable, and offer a 30-day guarantee. The Essential Open Earbuds are here for the holiday season and they are selling fast. Raycon audio products are up to 20% off this holiday season. Just click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/mertopen to save on Raycon audio products site-wide. Order by December 15th to guarantee delivery by Christmas because great gifts shouldn't show up late. Thank you to Raycon for sponsoring today's video. You are probably expecting me to say Stephen King wrote The Shining about the alcoholic father Jack Daniel Torrance coming slowly undone during his time at the Overlook Hotel and posing a direct danger to his family because he wanted to work through the worst case scenario possible for the slippery slope he was currently sliding down feet first, that he wrote it to directly confront the alcoholic demons inside him and reckon with those impulses before they affected his personal life. Well, I'm not. By the year 2000, when Stephen came to write his memoir titled On Writing, he was aware of how his reliance on alcoholism influenced how he wrote Jack Torrance. Before he got sober, as I understand it, he didn't make the connection. Stephen King is no stranger to the running joke that he writes himself. Almost every character he writes is a father, an author, and/or native to Maine, and although he will often deny subconscious themes in his writing, much to the exhausted affection of writer Michael R. Collins, who has written extensive analyses of Stephen King, King will occasionally admit one or two, but only if he figures it out himself. You can lead him to water all you want, but he will drink when he is good and ready. Stephen King admitted that Misery antagonist Annie Wilkes was a stand-in for his alcoholism and he didn't have a clue when he wrote it in 1987, yet he will still deny that The Dark Half, a book he wrote whilst getting sober after 8 years of drug addiction, focusing on the story of a man split into two warring personalities, was just a coincidence. And although King would admit that he had written The Shining without realising it was about himself, it wasn't because of Jack's alcoholism, a trait he refused to admit they shared in common for a while. It was because, for a period of time and for no reason that he could articulate, Stephen King really hated his kids. King's father, Donald Edwin King, had walked out on the family when Stephen was 2, leaving him and his brother to be raised by Ruth King, his mother. He also left them with all of his debt and refused to pay any child support, so ironic to the name, the King brothers spent their childhoods in poverty. Although King had a few father figures in his time, he discovered what fatherhood meant for himself through trial and error. When he and his university sweetheart Tabby got married and started a family, King had a lot to figure out about the kind of father he'd be able to be, and he had to do it quickly. The Shining is a story about a hotel, about murder, about a young family, about eccentric topiary, about alcoholism, yes, and The Shining is a story about fatherhood. More specifically, The Shining is a story about Stephen King's fears of failing to live up to fatherhood. Fathers are a huge recurring theme across this book. The side character will have 3 total lines and still their father will be mentioned. Danny's school friend Scotty's dad hit his wife while drunk. Caretaker Watson's dad used to keep a wood furnace for his old newspapers and invoices. Al Shockley's dad, Arthur Shockley, was a wealthy steel baron. George Hatfield, Jack's least favourite student, has a wealthy lawyer dad. Delbert Grady was a dad who murdered his whole family. Wendy is plagued by her mother, who still blames her for the divorce from her late father. But our central triad lies within the Torrance family tree. We have Mark Anthony Torrance, father to Jack Daniel Torrance, and most importantly we have Jack Daniel Torrance himself, father of 5-year-old Danny Anthony Torrance. When we meet Jack, he is wallowing in oceans of self-pity after single-handedly destroying his career and almost his life due to his temper issues and his alcoholism, represented physically by, the 50 beers he was pounding every day, but also his friend Al Shockley. Al short for alcohol, obviously. Well, partly the alcohol. I think the alcoholism exacerbated what was already there. Jack pulls some devious stunts while under the influence, but he's just as cruel when he's sober, especially towards his poor wife Wendy. Sometimes he's worse sober. Jack is a nasty, insecure guy with a violent temper, alcohol aside. When the Overlook Hotel is added to the mix, we have another spanner in these dysfunctional works. Like alcohol, it's another insidious presence digging its claws into Jack, magnifying his mood and actions. The Overlook Hotel was inspired by King's experience with the novel The Haunting of Hill House, which I'm starting to realise gets a heavy-handed, direct quote reference in basically every book he writes. King writes the hotel as a haunted place, like it does have ghosts, but it is also an evil living entity with malicious intent that grows stronger by consuming people with psychic abilities. And it is a great place to set a story about an abusive family. Danny is too powerful for the hotel, so its influence on the young family is limited. The strength of the Overlook is in its isolation. Even if the Overlook was a normal building, it would still be a contender for the worst place on the planet for Danny and Wendy Torrance. And why is that? Well, because it is cut off from the outside world. Jack Torrance, a man who has struggled with his temper his entire life and has hit both his wife and child in the past, purposefully and accidentally, moves his 5-year-old son and passive wife into a consequence-free environment. For him, obviously. There are no neighbours to overhear him shouting, there are no colleagues or teachers to notice bruises. If Wendy had a supportive family, they would be held at arm's length. If Danny and Wendy were to wind up dead, their bodies wouldn't be discovered until the spring, if at all. Escape for Wendy and Danny would be, as they'd find, impossible. This isn't a pack a bag and slip out into the night kind of situation. There's nowhere to go. When Wendy and Danny find themselves trapped in the hotel with a murderous man towards the end of the book, they have to lock him in a supply closet and start counting down the weeks until someone might check on them. One of the most enduring debates about The Shining focuses on one question. Was Jack Torrance always a bad man, or did he become bad because of the Overlook Hotel? The Overlook Hotel takes an interest in the Torrance family when it discovers that their young son Danny has something called the Shine, essentially psychic powers. He can read minds and transmit his thoughts to other people. He can also see ghosts, which at first manifest as flashes into the past, single photographic shots typically depicting their moment of death. When Danny visits the nicest suite in the hotel, the presidential suite, he sees brains and blood splattered up the wall, the murder that Jack knows occurred decades before. Dick Halloran, the hotel's cook and a fellow The Shining, reassures Danny that he's worked at the hotel for a long time and never encountered any real danger. You just look away or close your eyes and the visions will vanish. Danny, discovering a father figure in Halloran, follows his advice, but it soon stops working, and upon visiting the insidious room 217, Danny is strangled by the rotting naked ghost of an elderly woman who died by suicidal overdose in the bathtub years prior. Unbeknownst to the family, the Overlook is growing stronger during their stay because it is feeding on Danny's psychic ability. Yet to seal the deal and claim his power for itself, the hotel would need to kill Danny and consume his ghost, and it can't. So, plan B. Possess a weaker person and make them kill Danny. The hotel has done it before with Delbert Grady and family, although it's not confirmed whether this occurs because his daughters have ESP. I think Grady was possessed and used to murder his wife and daughters because the hotel knew that the girls wanted to burn the place down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they had the Shine in the same way Danny does. Either way, if it can happen once, it can happen again, so which parent would the Overlook choose? Jack or Wendy? Let's look at Wendy first. Why would she make a good possessee? What does she represent to the volatile Jack Torrance? Wendy is totally passive. Jack's influence has taught her over the years that there are consequences to her actions. Actions like asking questions or wanting to spend time together. Jack is exhausted by her. He thinks she is stupid and annoying. Wendy tells us that she could count on 2 hands the times Jack has told her that he loves her, but he tells Danny that he loves him all the time. She sees this as an indication of Jack's love for Danny and not his disdain for her. However, Jack is not the reason why Wendy is passive. He is just the person who exploits her passivity because even at his nicest, he subconsciously knows she won't put up a fight. The reason why Wendy is this way is because of her mother, who haunts her just as Jack's father haunts him. It's clear from Wendy's recollections that her mother was narcissistically abusive to her and Wendy's late unnamed father. Wendy's mother has sabotaged her ability to function within a family, to recognize problems, and to walk away from toxic situations. Wendy was driven from her home in the wake of her parents' divorce, the divorce her mother blamed her for, calling her a homewrecker. Her relationship with her mother is so miserable, and long-term estrangement is so fundamental to Wendy's experience of motherhood that she sees no future where Danny will stay in her life no matter what she does. Wendy lacks the ability to assert herself in a relationship. She ignores red flags or finds some reason to make them her fault. No matter how Wendy sugarcoats Jack's actions in her POV chapters, or how Jack justifies his behaviour in his POV chapters, we can read between the lines. They moved in quickly because Wendy wanted to escape her mother. Jack began encouraging Wendy to cut her mother off. Valid, but this is the fire wanting you to cut off the frying pan. It was Jack's idea to take a break at one point to get perspective on the relationship, coming back to Wendy a few months later and promising dearly that he certainly hadn't used that time to pursue other women, I promise. Yet in Dr. Sleep, the 2013 sequel to The Shining, we learn that Jack has at least one illegitimate child from at least one affair he had during their marriage. Wendy recalls many nights when Jack promised to be home early, only to drive home at dawn, still drunk, clothes all ripped up from fighting people in car parks. Jack would look at them and the self-loathing would back up his throat in a bitter wave. His mind would turn thoughtfully to the gun or the rope or the razor blade, emphasizing his priorities during his active addiction. His thoughts turned to suicide more than they turned to getting well. He was gleeful when Wendy wasn't able to find a publisher for a book she wrote. He liked that she failed. She recalls how his impatient laughter always made her feel so awkward. Jack's only method of erasing her fears of inadequacy, that Wendy tells us of, is by leading her to bed after a day's work and having sex with her. And that's before they're in the Overlook Hotel. Jack shouts at Wendy 10 times more than he laughs at her jokes or agrees with her observations. This gets worse as he falls under the influence of the hotel. Danny narrates a moment where Jack laughs at a joke Wendy makes while they are eating dinner, and it was such a standout moment in the story that I wrote it down. He calls her the stupidest bitch. He strived to keep his voice pleasant. She was prying, the way she had always pried. Where are you going? When will you be back? Will one of you stay sober? She had driven him to drink. Nag and nag and nag until you wanted to clout her one. Innocent questions like, what about the history of the hotel interests you? Gets Wendy shouted at. Jack apologizes every time, blames it on tiredness or stress or headaches, and Wendy shuffles back into place. She'll be mad at him for a bit, she won't laugh at his jokes, and then feels so guilty for her hostility that she springs back like an elastic band and apologizes. His abuse was visible to the other faculty wives, who were watching her with pitying looks. Her husband was a lush. He had a bad temper, one he could no longer keep wholly under control now that he was drinking so heavily and his writing was going so badly. Towards the end of this book, it's the hotel talking through Jack, but he's always been like this. One of the biggest relationship lessons I've ever had to learn was, if he shouts at you once, he'll shout at you again. And the earlier in the relationship they shout, the worse it's gonna get. And obviously replace shout with any kind of red flag. The difficult outcome of a lesson like this is that more often than not, you just have to bail when it starts happening. Oh, what if this is just the one time? It's not. It never is. The benefit of the doubt is reserved for people with a good track record. If you stick around, it will happen again. Only you'll be another few weeks into your sunk cost, and you'll have forgiven him for it once already, which makes it really difficult to put your foot down a second time for the same thing. You have to be brave, and the longer you wait, the braver you have to be. Wendy is such a tragic character because I think so many of us can see ourselves in her. Especially in the book, when Jack's drip feed of worsening abuse begins to creep up until hitting and screaming is a daily occurrence. You see how he treats her, and you're like, oh, Wendy, you should have been out of here years ago. The whole time we have her mother's voice in her head. You showed your true colours when you came between your father and me, is the accusation Wendy recalls, projecting her fear of coming between your father and me onto Danny and Jack. She is terrified that by taking Danny away, she will be a homewrecker again. Jack's frequent abuse and gaslighting combines seamlessly with her mother's lingering impact and deters her from putting herself first. In Wendy's mother's eyes, she is the victim and Wendy is the aggressor. Through a lifetime of emotional abuse, Wendy now believes this to be true. Her mother left her with the lingering impression that she had committed some nebulous, undefined sin that Wendy must eternally atone for. A permanent emotional debt that is always owed, no matter what. Wendy's duty to her family is poison to her. Although Wendy went no contact with her mother for a while, the birth of Danny forced an uneasy reconciliation. This makes Wendy's life worse, but she endures it out of fear that she is driving a wedge between her mother and her son. During her guilty visits home, Wendy's mother belittles her, sneers at her attempts at motherhood, and makes her feel inadequate. She wants to steal Danny away. Wendy admits that she would have left ages ago if not for the fact that Danny would be broken by a separation. She stays because Danny is Jack's son. Jack was the only one that baby Danny didn't throw up on, the only parent who could put him to sleep in a matter of seconds. At 5 years old, Danny sits on the roadside waiting for his dad to come home. Everything out of his mouth is "Daddy said this" and "Daddy said that," and he has perfectly adopted Jack's mannerisms. Jack is explicit with us that he will kill himself if his wife leaves him. I don't think Wendy is aware of this, but she stays with her mother because she feels responsible for her mother's happiness, and she stays with Jack because she feels responsible responsible for his happiness. Having responsibility for the emotional state of other adults is what she was raised to believe is normal. Upon arriving at the hotel, Wendy remarked that a season away from the world was exactly what their family needed. I wonder if she felt that because she thought that Jack without external stimuli would change for the better, or because she felt like being trapped together would override that voice in the back of her head telling her that things aren't working out. Wendy compares Jack to the boiler in the basement of the hotel, requiring the frequent letting of steam lest it blow the overlook sky high and take them all with it. Wendy thinks it would almost be good to see him curse and kick a chair or slam a door. She had the feeling Jack was often angry with her or Danny, but was refusing to let it out. What a life Wendy leads if it would be a relief for Jack to slam doors and break things. When Danny locks himself in the bathroom and won't respond to Wendy through the door, she raises her voice in panic. Jack snaps, "Jesus Christ, Wendy, I can't think if you're gonna pound on the door all night." Although Wendy realizes that to push on would require stepping on more shattered eggshells, she perseveres because she is worried about her son. This makes Jack angry, and he threatens to hit Danny so hard that he'll be sleeping on his belly. He's angry, not concerned, even though Danny may well have drowned in the bath. When he kicks the door down and finds Danny sitting in silence, he shoves Wendy aside so hard that she crashes into a towel rack. Parents panic, sure, but Jack uses these moments to physically dominate and humiliate his wife. This reaches a boil towards the end of the story. After Danny is strangled and Jack is almost fully possessed, singing eerily downstairs in the ballroom, Wendy realizes that she is going to be forced to try and placate him. Her abusive husband is the only one who can help her, and her desperation will fuel the power dynamic. It's only at this moment when Wendy regrets not divorcing him when she had the chance, realizing that she will need to walk the halls of the hotel with a knife until she is either rescued or killed. Wendy spends the book hoping that something will fix their situation, still hoping that something will make Jack a nicer man or make her a better wife, heavy quotations, and part of her arc in this story is realizing that Jack is Jack, promises are just words, and sometimes you can't just leave things in the past, namely, Danny's broken arm. Danny's broken arm is a moment in the story you'll probably find fascinating once you realise that it's kinda taken from Stephen King's own life. In Haunted Heart, when Rogak is discussing King's rocky introduction to fatherhood and his feelings of resentment, she tells a familiar story. When his son Joe was 3 years old, King found his boy at the scene of a crime. Joe had scribbled all over King's manuscripts in crayon. Joe wanted to do what his dad did, without really understanding the concept of editorial process. King remembered thinking, "That son of a bitch, I could kill him." Curiously, Jack Torrance would come to find Danny in his office, only the details of the scene have been adjusted. I don't know how many pages Joe managed to take a crayon to, but even if it was a lot of pages, a crayon is not a particularly destructive medium of creative expression on a page written using a typewriter, which King exclusively wrote on, unless he wrote it in longhand, but I don't think he did. You're welcome to correct me. King occasionally tells on himself because he, like many of us, thinks that the human experience is more homogenous than it is. He often makes comments suggesting that he says out loud what others are too scared to say, and one of the most curious involves The Shining, which King claimed he wrote about the impulses that dwell in every human being, i.e. Jack Torrance. Living briefly in Boulder, Colorado, he remarked that he felt a range of emotions from resentment to anger to outright hate towards his 3 children, Naomi, Joe, and Owen, and that he felt hostile to his kids. He wanted to grab them and hit them. The Shining became a healthy journaling exercise in self-purging for King, a way to work through his feelings of anger towards his children and come to terms with the experience of fatherhood without needing to lash out externally. In The Shining, Danny takes cans of beer to Jack's manuscripts. He soaks the pile of paper through. This is a far more destructive approach to proofreading than Joe's efforts. Pages would be stuck together, dissolved in beery foam, ink would run, you'd tear the pages when you try to separate them, and so on. This manuscript is gone, not scribbled on. When Jack grabs Danny and yanks him away from the paper, breaking his arm in the process, it's the closest thing to an accident he'll ever do in the book. Which is ironic, considering it's the thing that Wendy hates him the most for. Wendy should have divorced him here. This event causes her to hate him, it shatters their dynamic. She never looks at him the same way, never sees him as a safe place again. Living in an isolated hotel is not an effective substitute for marriage counselling, which the two sorely need. When Danny shows up with strangle marks, courtesy of the aforementioned overdose ghost lady of room 217, Wendy naturally assumes it was Jack. For the first time in the story, it wasn't Jack. Wendy's knee-jerk reaction, driven by the logic of Jack being the only possible perpetrator and with a track record of laying his hands on their son, is a reasonable assumption that alienates the one remaining part of Jack that might have treated this mistaken accusation with the slightest bit of grace. Wendy wants to take Danny to a doctor, but Jack reminds her that the roads are snowed in. She points out that they have a snowmobile. Jack ignores this, makes sarcastic remarks, asks how she expects him to fly down there if she thinks he's Superman. The safety of their son matters less to him than taking digs at his terrified wife, who has now realised that they are not alone here in the Overlook Hotel. Wendy gives ground to a man who will never respect her for it, saying, "Sometimes I am like my mother. I can be a bitch, but you have to understand that some things are hard to get over." And Jack, realising that she is referencing Danny's broken arm, becomes irate at her. There is never a drop of empathy from Jack, who expects everyone to overlook, if you'll pardon the pun, his flaws, his moments of weakness, his temperament. Everything he does is something he expected Wendy to have gotten over already. After Jack slaps Danny across the face, Wendy says, "You want me to apologise for calling you a bastard? Okay, I'm sorry. You still shouldn't have hit him. You promised you'd never do it again." Towards the end of the book, when Jack is almost entirely under the sway of the hotel, he denies Danny having seen the topiary move. Despite him himself seeing the topiary move, he swore to himself that if Wendy asked right now, he would come clean about everything. After 300 pages of walking on eggshells, Jack expects Wendy to extend a hand and ask, "Are you sure you didn't lie about seeing the topiary move?" A question that any other time would earn her a screaming at or a slap. Jack is surprised that Wendy doesn't make an effort after conditioning her not to make an effort. In fact, when Wendy then asks Jack to help her get the snowmobile, he becomes incandescent with rage at her nagging. "I love you too," he says, but specifies to us that he's only mouthing the words, like a kid pretending to sing along to hymns in church. One of the reasons why Jack is so angry at this question is because Wendy wants to get Danny down to the nearest town, Sidewinder, but she hasn't given any thought as to how Jack is going to find work or stay off the wagon. That horrible woman is just thinking about her son, not her husband, who knows that he will fail to find a job and will obviously go back to drinking, and so he sabotages the snowmobile, tossing the spark plugs off into the snow. Now obviously by this point in the book, Jack is almost entirely under the influence of the Overlook. However, this is their dynamic. The Overlook is still just building on it. Wendy has cultivated an environment in which Jack's sins are forgiven, or at least evened out by hers, even if he's hitting their child and she is just calling him a bastard. Thanks to her mother's voice, Wendy treats these as equivalent. "It's my fault as much as yours" is a standard Wendy affirmation, and it is almost never true. Seeing her father wither away and die under the abusive control of her mother, hearing Jack constantly accuse her of being her mother, makes it really difficult for Wendy to differentiate between moments when she is justified in standing up for herself. There's one moment where Jack hits Danny and Wendy remarks, "He looks older now. He looks defeated." Boo-hoo, you may say, and you would be right, but realize that she is looking at Jack and seeing her father. By holding him accountable, Wendy thinks that she is draining the life from Jack the same way that her mother drained the life from her father. There's a moment where Jack is shown a vision by the hotel that tricks him into smashing the only radio to pieces. Wendy comes in and observes his real face, which she calls a face of desperate unhappiness. Jack's eternal victimhood prevents him from being productive, from explaining. No one could possibly understand his struggles, least of all his wife, so he just yells at her about how she won't let him forget Danny's broken arm while she tries to communicate that she also fell asleep and Danny is now missing. Jack tries to pull himself together, going, "I'm sorry, Wendy, it was just the dream. I'm upset. Forgive? She's cold-faced, reaching the end of some tether, but clearly not her final one, and Jack is already irritated with her again. Despite the fact that he has just apologized for yelling at her, Jack has to control his rage to ask, is he not sleeping in his room? Wendy's lack of a support system makes walking away from Jack impossible. She is a stay-at-home mum, trapped in the house with Danny because they can't afford childcare. She has no friends and no colleagues, and definitely no family. She also has no money. Wendy only has Jack and Danny, like, in the world. Therefore, she is incentivized to try and stay and work things out, because the alternative is likely homelessness, or worse, going back to live with her mother. It would also mean admitting defeat. Her mother warned her away from Jack, but even a broken clock is right twice per day. Maybe her mother was jealous that Wendy had found love. Maybe her mother warned her away from all of her other boyfriends and Jack was no exception. Maybe she just wanted to make Wendy feel like shit. When they married, her mother's remarks shifted, saying, he'll take his joy out of the house if you're not holding him right, implying that Wendy would be at fault if Jack cheated or stayed out in bars. It would be proof that she wasn't fun enough, passive enough, interesting enough, good enough. To leave Jack would be to allow her mother emotionally abusive gloating privileges that Wendy would likely end up having to live with. At least her abusive husband pretends to be sorry sometimes. Despite Wendy's passivity, she has wished for change, sometimes off her own back and sometimes through an act of God. She had seen the end of their marriage many times. Divorce, Jack's DUI death, and occasionally in daydreams of her and Danny being saved by a Galahad. Wendy lacks agency because she doesn't know what healthy looks like. Wendy feels like a bull in a china shop. Everything she does breaks something. Everything is her fault. In my video on It, I critiqued King heavily for the way he wrote Beverly Marsh, because yes, victims of abuse can be hypersexual, but I don't think it's any coincidence that the only woman in the cast is the hypersexual abuse victim who processes her abusive past by being really sexy and hot and having orgasms when she gets raped, not as a passive helpless result of physical stimulation, but because she secretly loves how it reminds her of her father. Every line of description focusing on her 13-year-old thighs or her 40-year-old breasts. I really hated how he wrote Beverly, but I love how he wrote Wendy. Wendy isn't some kick-ass heroine, she's an abuse victim too, and she's incredibly well written. Still, despite her weakness, she is a stronger person than Jack, and that's why the hotel doesn't pick her, because there are some fundamentals she is unshakable on. Jack, even at his most spiteful, comments, Wendy would set herself on fire before laying a finger on Danny, conspicuously othering himself in the process. Jack admits by omission how easy he finds it to hurt his son, and that's why the hotel chooses him. A man doesn't abuse his wife and kid because he's strong. The hotel plays on his weakness. He's susceptible to the idea of hitting his family, and Wendy isn't. Wendy would never hurt Danny. In On Writing, Stephen King describes his childhood as a fogged-out landscape from which occasional memories appear like isolated trees. Although he reflects on many happy past moments, King missed out on a lot as a child growing up in poverty. As someone who was unofficially banned from the Boy Scouts because he didn't have a dad to help out, it's understandable that most of King's childhood trauma revolves around his father, who his aunts and uncles nicknamed Daddy Done Left, King referring to the absent Donald as an unperson. Uncle Fred didn't have much of a sense of humour, and Uncle Orrin drank and had dark theories about the Jews, but they were there, he reflected. There are lots of fathers in my stories, and some are abusive and some try to be loving and supportive, which is what I had always hoped I would be as a dad, but my father was just an absence. To King, any father was better than no father. The grass is always greener, I suppose, but Don's absence created a vacuum of fatherhood to be filled by King's experience. An image of fatherhood is easy to create when you're not a father. We can all imagine a father, but all Stephen had to fill that void was himself. King has always been an anxious individual. He describes himself as having a permanent address in the People's Republic of Paranoia. When reading books, he says he won't stop at pages 94, 193, or 382, for example, since the sums of these numbers add up to 13. He once stated on Dennis Miller's TV talk show that planes are kept in the air by the terror of nervous flyers, which acts as a kind of psychic force. The first way he learned that he could block out those anxieties was through writing. King's mother Ruth told him early on that if you say the worst case scenario to yourself 3 times, it can't come true. That's good advice. If you accept the worst case, you face it head on. It eliminates the ability to deny it, the ability for it to bloom out of control before you're forced to acknowledge it. Only Stephen King was very superstitious, and this took on a life of its own for him. The reason King wrote so much is because there's not a crumb sum of human experience that doesn't inspire fear in him. Anxiety is the price we pay for imagination, and King ran up a big bill. Almost every lived experience he had ended up warped by his fears into one of his many stories. Like, King wrote Pet Sematary out of fear of the deadly road his youngest son Owen almost wandered out onto, for example. The logic was, if you wrote about these impossible scenarios, then they wouldn't come true. And like my cat trying to bury her dinner on the kitchen floor every night to keep it from being eaten by competition, despite her being a comfortable house cat living in relative luxury, it's clearly worked so far, so why not keep doing it? We're never explicitly told why the Overlook Hotel chooses Jack to be the one to kill Danny, but I mean, I'm sure we can make an educated guess. Jack's an angry, bitter man who rouses grudges out of nowhere. He's no stranger to getting physical, drunk or not. He hits his wife and child multiple times across the course of the story. Every time he says sorry, promises not to do it again, is forgiven, and reoffends within 30 pages. He is also haunted by the lingering trauma of being raised under his father, Mark Anthony Torrance, who beat his mother half to death in front of him when he was only 9 years old. Jack has 3 siblings, none of which he makes any present-day reference to. One of them died in Vietnam, but the rest of them still seem to be alive. He has either abandoned his support system or they have abandoned him, and my theory is the latter, because Jack did grow up to be his father, who his siblings all hated and feared. The Overlook doesn't possess just anyone. There were loads of staff working there without issues for years before the Torrances arrived. Although Jack visits the hotel for an interview, he doesn't fall under the influence of the Overlook Hotel until Danny steps onto the premises, and it creeps up on him in small, indistinguishable ways. His old symptoms of alcoholism come back, like his ratty temper and his dry lips that he wipes with the back of his hand, and he sees the topiary move. You can interpret the hotel as having a hold on him from the moment he moves there, which can make it difficult to figure out what real Jack is like. We see some of Jack's past behaviour in flashbacks, but my favourite Jack Torrance memory is part of the story as it's told in the present. It's his job interview, which occurs right at the beginning of the book. We meet Jack here for the first time in a job interview with hotel manager Mr. Ullman. Jack is basically here on his hands and knees begging to work a job very few people would ever consider taking because he has rendered himself unhireable following an assault on a student named George Hatfield. George Hatfield's story is told through a series of flashbacks and omissions. When Jack first recounts it to us, he tells a tale of an unfortunate accident, an unpreventable, tragic mistake born from a genuine intention to do good. Initially, we are sold the story of dumb, delinquent vandal George Hatfield slashing Jack's tyres following his being cut from the debate team. Jack stepping in stone cold sober, accidentally hitting him too hard in the resulting tussle and resulting in his firing. What, a guy can't defend himself when his property is being defaced? This is wokeism gone mad. I love the way George Hatfield's story is told in The Shining, and it's a shame it didn't make it into the movie, but would have likely rounded it up to a solid 3 hours, and we're not making Das Boot here. We receive more facts as the story unfolds, namely that George Hatfield, son of a rich and successful lawyer, joined the debate team because he and his father wanted to leverage it to get into a good college, only to discover a love for debate that blossomed into a talent. Jack observed that George was competitive, versatile, and extremely talented, but he stuttered. Bitter over George's privileged upbringing, jealous that George had a rich father so invested in his son that he pulled strings to help him find the same success, Jack saw George as undeserving. He wasn't getting into debate for the right reasons, Jack felt, and I guess George got into debate because his father put him into the debate team, but he ended up loving it. Initially, we're told that George lashed out at Jack because he believed he had set the timer forward, which sabotaged George's debate. Jack denies this. Later, Jack admits that he did set the timer forward, but only to do George and the team a favour, not out of hate, but pity. He stuttered, and there's no way that George could have known, and Jack was absolutely sure that George had cheated on his final composition too. He just couldn't prove it. The tyre slashing incident occurred when Jack used the cut time as justification to kick George Hatfield out of the debate team. George had come to him privately. The belligerent "I'm sticking up for my rights" way that George was looking at him had sparked Jack's temper. He had been off the sauce 2 months too long. He made one last effort to hold himself in. Jack never holds himself in. He mocks the stutter that George insists he doesn't have, then flushes with anger and shame at his own cruelty, reflecting the way he often regrets how he behaves, but never stops behaving behaving that way impulsively. He revels at having power in the situation, getting to watch George yell at him powerlessly. He felt sick exultation. For the first time in his life, George Hatfield wanted something he could not have. Daddy's money could not fix a speech impediment. George went out into the parking lot and slashed Jack's tires. Jack recalls blacking out, coming to with his hands raised in front of his face. George lying on the floor, blood seeping out of his ear. George's injuries are so bad that he is taken out of school. The rest of the debate team are watching, and Jack feels sure they'll understand. When he was himself, there wasn't a nicer guy in the whole state of Vermont. Jack explains to us. Surely they knew that. Jack sees his violence as something separate from him. He is a nice man who does nice things. When bad things happen, it's not his fault and it's not him doing it, and he shouldn't be held accountable. To him, he is more of a victim of his violence than anyone else. Wendy recites the story to Danny. George said your daddy cut him because he didn't like him and not because he wasn't good enough, reflecting the lies he has told her in an effort to convince himself. His attitude is fueled by a world of people who excuse his behaviour. Al Shockley reassures Jack that I'll have the board around by spring. Effinger's already saying they might have been too hasty, depicting a system constructed to write off his violence. Getting fired is quite a light punishment for hitting a teenage boy so hard that you disable him, regardless of whose tyres were being slashed and regardless of who got cut from the debate team and why. Jack only has to wait a year and he will go back to his job on probation. The kids he traumatized will graduate and he will have a clean slate. No lessons learned. Jack believes he is the helpless victim of a world that has done nothing but force his violence. Jack is haunted by George in the Overlook, which manifests ghostly versions of the teenage boy to torment him. Curiously, these versions of George do not stutter. You're welcome to decide whether you think George Hatfield stuttered. I don't think he did, or at least nowhere near the extent that Jack describes it, where every word out of George's mouth becomes a several-minute obstacle course. I think that Jack tells us that George stuttered because it bolsters his case. I think the Overlook taunts him with reality, where the real truth of Jack's guilt lives. Jack and George's relationship is symbolised in the play that Jack never seems to get around to finishing. He calls it The Little School. Jack wrote The Little School whilst working at his own little school, Stovington Prep. Wendy observes that Jack does best when he has an outlet for his anger. Initially it was football, but Jack commented he had not enjoyed football. Every game was like a grudge match because he played like a honey badger. Jack dabbled in writing stories, but his next major project was his play. We first hear about the play through Danny, when he recounts the way his daddy would stomp around the house furiously, demandingly asking Wendy where he'd left his play. The Little School focuses on the story of two characters, Headmaster Denker, a gifted student who failed into becoming the brutal and brutalizing headmaster of a New England prep school, and Gary Benson, the student he sees as a younger version of himself, who he had initially written as more cursed with money than blessed with it, who wanted to compile a good record for school because he had earned admission and not because his father had pulled strings. Jack becomes roadblocked on the ending, as he identifies with Gary and Denker in different ways. Believing them both to be reflections of him, he can't bring himself to have either of them lose. He doesn't know how to end the play. He even saw a little bit of George Hatfield in Gary Benson, but commented with bemusement that well, Denker grew to hate Gary, and Jack had never felt that way about George. If he had, he'd have known it. As the Overlook continues to dig in, he flips the other way, identifying with Denker. Denker had to work all his life just to run a school, which was now faced with ruin over this handsome, innocent-seeming rich boy who cheated on his final composition. Gary always addressed Denker as Sir, but Jack realised now that he had been sarcastic about it the whole time, understanding that the tragedy was not the intellectual racking of Gary, but rather the destruction of a kindly old headmaster. Jack considered an ending where Denker beats Gary to death with a poker, then screams at the audience that he will find it. What it was, I don't remember because I never wrote it down. Maybe he's talking about the book that Stephen King wrote. Jack's 180 on Gary Benson comes about as a result of reflections on a story he wrote earlier in his career, titled The Monkey Is Here, about a child molester who is in the process of killing himself. Jack comes to identify more with the child molester than Gary Benson, because because the child molester represents a thought experiment for Jack regarding how much he could justifiably get away with, how much of a monster he could be and still sympathize with himself. Not that Book Jack is a child molester, although you could make a solid case for Movie Jack, but that Jack displaces all the blame for his behavior onto his past, whilst holding everyone else around him totally responsible for all of their behavior, even when their behavior is a reaction to his treatment of them. Jack sympathized with Monkey because he was not totally to blame. His bad beating father, his mother a limp and silent dish rag, a homosexual experience at grammar school, public humiliation, and worse in high school and college. We know that Jack had a beating father and a limp and silent mother. I wonder if the latter 2 points also had relevance to his past either. If Jack was writing a story about a child molester with his own past experiences to say, look at how bad I could be. I deserve to be truly, truly evil after everything that's happened to me. You're lucky that I'm just as bad as I am. I've risen above my past. George and Jack have a complicated, one-sided relationship. At first, Jack identifies with him. George eventually antagonizes him and then becomes a helpless stand-in for Danny. George is the grandfather, the father, and the son at various points in the book. When faced with George's ghost, Jack manifests the same walking stick that he watched his father beat his mother with, and beats George with it, saying, "Take your medicine, young pup, young worthless cur," like his father did. George's ghost turns into Danny, foretelling a worrying future. When Jack saw Danny spill beer on his papers, a red cloud of rage eclipsed Jack's reason. It only seemed slow, the way some dreams seemed slow. He spun Danny to spank him, hearing a clean sound with the past on one half of it and the future on another. He stared at his son, trying to understand how this could have happened. Being in shock is understandable, but Jack leverages his confusion to turn every violent incident into an accident, something he was somehow absent for. Jack's only thoughts are about himself, what this means for him. It did not occur to him what that hate might mean in practical terms. It was only later he realized she might have left him that night, gone to a motel or called the police. He felt staggered by it. All alone. No matter how much he hurts his wife and child, Jack only pities himself. In fact, Jack recalled the night after he brained George against his car. What had followed that interview was the darkest, most dreadful night of his life. The need to get drunk had never been so bad, and he kept wanting to take it out on Wendy and Danny. His temper was like a vicious animal on a frayed leash. If he did, Wendy would leave him at last, and take Danny with her. He would be dead from the day they left. I write in the margins of the first page, Jack is sitting on a geyser of rage, because there really is no other way to describe this man. Having tested his wife and wore away at his marriage through years of drinking, and then getting sober just in time to smack the tits off a teenage boy he had spitefully wronged for no other reason than jealousy over his rich father, Jack is now sitting in the office of his last hope, Mr. Ullman. Jack's friend Al Shockley, although also a raging alcoholic, now also on the wagon, is the son of a rich steel baron. While Jack's life crumbled around him, Al separated from his wife but never faced homelessness like Jack did. Al remained a very wealthy man, and out of sympathy for his co-wagon driver Jack, sorted him out with an interview at the Overlook Hotel, of which he is the majority shareholder. Ullman is forthcoming about the fact that he wouldn't have hired Jack if not for Al, and as the reader in Jack's shoes, I think it can be quite easy to take that personally. Jack's first thought, the first line in the book, is calling Ullman an officious little prick. Jack describes this man like some leering tycoon lording it over him, but when we examine this scene through the cracks in Jack's narration, we see that Ullman has sincere and reasonable concerns about Jack and his family living in the hotel. Jack smugly tells us about what he calls his PR grin, this large and insultingly toothy sardonic smile, and brags about how perfectly he's playing off how much he hates Ullman. Bear in mind, they've only just met. Jack hates this man so much before he learns anything about him because he resents that Ullman represents his last opportunity to save his marriage. He's got a major chip on his shoulder about wealth. He fills this interview with petty remarks, and Ullman totally clocks him, pointing out to Jack that he can tell he doesn't like him. Jack is stunned to find Ullman can tell he doesn't like him after he did such a good job of demonstrating how much he doesn't like him. Jack is a man who thinks he is much smarter than he is. He thinks he is owed success. He thinks he would be one of the greatest American writers in history, just so long as he can get one place play published. One play he's been procrastinating on writing for years. He is bitter about anyone that challenges this mindset, especially Ullman, who seems to possess above average human intelligence. The idea that he's not the smartest person in the room enrages Jack. When Ullman tells Jack not to let his 5-year-old son in the attic, Jack bitterly internally remarks, "Did this officious little prick think he'd allow his son to goof around in a rat trap attic?" He finds it insulting that Ullman feels the need to tell him about the dangers of the hotel, when he's probably legally obligated to be clear about them. When Ullman warns him that the Overlook will basically be cut off from civilization for months, Jack snarkily disagrees, since they have a radio, so technically that's not true. Ullman gently reminds Jack that if anybody were to have an accident, say his 5-year-old son, they would never get help in time. He has Jack's son's well-being in his mind more than Jack does, and Jack hates him for it. It's Ullman's fault for being better than him, not an opportunity for Jack to reflect and improve. When Ullman explains that the previous winter caretaker, Delbert Grady, was a drunk, Jack takes that as a personal dig about his own history. Ullman goes, "No, I mean to say, he was a drunk man in a bad place who murdered his wife and children." Jack handwaves Ullman, with "a stupid man is just as prone to cabin fever as he is to shoot someone. Nothing to do but bitch at his wife and nag at the kids and drink." He feels truly above the man he will soon follow in the footsteps of. All of his behaviour is geared towards biting the hand that hasn't fed him yet. He despises Ullman because he is well dressed and proud of his work and wants to hire the right person for the job. Jack knows that he is not the right person for the job, but knows that he has no choice. Yet Jack acts like his being there is beneath him. He stews in his seat in a furious rage like a child in detention, angry that this is the relatively lenient consequence of years of his actions. As the scene concludes, Ullman says that he hopes there's no hard feelings. No hard feelings. Jack flashed his PR grin. There were hard feelings. All kinds of them. Jack is still seething over Ullman's read of him in chapter 3, when caretaker Mr. Watson is trying to explain that the boiler will explode if he allows the pressure to build up too high, allowing his emotions to cloud himself again in such a way that puts his family once more at risk. When Mr. Watson advises Jack to keep an eye on his boy, the advice doesn't sting so much because he doesn't consider Mr. Watson to be clever enough to be a threat to him. King has historically been extremely protective over Jack Torrance's characterization, becoming upset with how Jack was depicted in Kubrick's movie rather than the well-intentioned, complex victim King wanted us to see him as. If you own the 2001 edition of The Shining, the version with the wasp on the front, you'll find that King has stitched an author's note into the beginning of it. I don't think it's a coincidence that this author's note was added into the edition that was published just after Stanley Kubrick died, most likely because, legally, King was not allowed to slag Kubrick's work off as per the terms of his contract with Warner Brothers to write the miniseries, but secondarily because it allowed him the privilege of having the last word on the subject without anticipating any kind of response. Although it felt somewhat poor taste to do a quick "by the way" after your cinematic op passes, I had equally mixed feelings about the actual content of the foreword. King explains that the story was about Jack's love of his father despite, or maybe even because of, his unpredictable and brutal nature, that Jack is a good person driven mad, and that he wrote it with the assumption that Jack was, first and foremost, driven insane by the ghosts of the hotel, but secondarily by the ghost of his father. I don't love this, especially for a horror book. Having the author's intentions spelled out to you before you even read a word of the story isn't ideal for a story that revels in the blurred lines between Jack's temper and insidious ghostly influence. Although King hedges the foreword with lots of careful language to make it absolutely clear that this is his opinion as much as anyone else's, authorial intent still counts for a bit, and I think that specifying these things up front is going to subconsciously taint a reader's experience with Jack Torrance, regardless of how carefully you tiptoe around it. Still, it exists, and in a way it's good, because it allows us to understand what King considered to be the emotional core of the story. Not Danny and Jack, but Jack and his father, Mark Anthony Torrance. King eliminated any room for interpretation by asserting, "I always thought there were malevolent ghosts in the Overlook driving Jack to the precipice, that Jack was only capable of the violence he enacted because those ghosts took a boiling pot of pre-existing problems and pushed him into murder." That said, he emphasized that Jack was haunted by many ghosts, saying, "Jack Torrance is a haunted house. Specifically, Jack is a man haunted by his past who walks into a malevolent building that takes him, warps him, possesses him, and uses him." King leaves a lot of room for death of the author here by asserting that he always thought Jack should be a particular way. He's very careful not to tell you exactly what he intends, but I think King struggles to let go of Jack more than he thinks he does. While this note, written 2 years after Kubrick died, emphasizes that King has a personal interpretation, but you're welcome to take it however you want, he still had to sign a gag order because he kept slagging the film off. He's not as graceful in practice. I think Kubrick did a great job of depicting Jack Torrance. I like his interpretation of the story. It doesn't feel the same as the book. They're both different experiences, but it's still great. The book never would have worked as a movie because it would have been 4 hours long and full of awful CGI with all those topiary animals. Oh wait. Despite the parallel journeys of Book Jack and Movie Jack, it clearly wasn't what King had in mind. King and Kubrick both wrote about a father who, even before standing on the hotel grounds, was a top-level shithouse. King and Kubrick both created stories that focused on the way said hotel may or may not have taken what was already there, filtered out the sediment, and distilled it to its most evil form. And yet King hated Kubrick's rendition because Kubrick's rendition of Jack Torrance demonstrated that, right from the start, Jack was evil. And King wrote The Shining about himself. If King accepted that Jack Torrance was an evil man, not a good man in a bad situation, then what might that say about him? Jack Torrance obviously isn't King, and this obviously isn't autobiographical. It's a writing exercise he did to purge himself of the feelings he was having around his own fatherhood. In fact, I think King did a lot more than merely write Jack Torrance as a stand-in for his own fears of fatherhood. None of the characters are 100% King, because this is fiction, and character arcs must arc, but there's a little bit of him everywhere. I think that Danny represents his inner child. I think Danny's not-so-imaginary friend Tony represents the reassurances King wishes he could send back in time to his younger self, and I believe that Mark Anthony Torrance, Jack's father, is him working through feelings about his own father's absence. Stephen King saw Jack Daniel Torrance as a morally grey character because he saw himself as Jack Daniel Torrance, but personally I always saw Jack as an insidious individual, and for the record I don't have that opinion of Stephen King, because I do not know Stephen King personally. Sure, Jack was led astray by ghosts, but even from the beginning he committed acts of violence and behaved selfishly. Even before the ghosts of the Overlook, he was a selfish, angry man wallowing in the swamps of his perceived victimhood. The reality of Mark Anthony Torrance is drip-fed to us. Initially, as a "my dad was a dick" offhand comment delivered during Jack's briefing on the boiler, Mark Anthony is slowly fleshed out until we realise that he was an abusive monster who terrorised his family until his death. King does a fantastic job of writing a household of abuse where Jack was the golden child. He, the youngest, flew under the radar of Mark's rage, and it was only as he got older that he began to recognise how all of his siblings hated their father. In fact, you won't even know Jack had siblings until well past the halfway point of the book. Mark provides a situation where Jack is a victim. Mark becomes someone Jack doesn't know what to feel about. He loved his dad because his dad treated him well. He hated his dad because of the things he did to his family. Can't reconcile those feelings, so they haunt him. Jack talks around his father for the bulk of the story. He recalls loving his father unconditionally in spite of spankings, black and blues, and occasional black eyes. Jack, like Danny, would wait by the door for his father to get home. His father was also a drunk. Sometimes he would pick Jack up and swing him around, and sometimes he would drunkenly toss him into the ceiling. He recalls that his father would arrive home with a banging door and a bellow, a noise that struck terror into his family. Jack never knew different, never found it strange that love went hand in hand with fear. His relationship with his father felt like unfurling a flower of potential, which turned out to be blighted inside. The event that changed everything for Jack was fairly simple. Having fallen asleep at the dinner table, Mark Anthony Torrance woke up and, as though having heard some taunting words from his wife, immediately began beating her head in with his walking cane. This walking cane is embedded in Jack's memory. The sound of it makes him flinch decades later. It's the weapon that manifests in his hand to hit ghostly George Hatfield with. The thing that upset Jack most was the reaction of his Catholic mother, who lied to the doctors to cover for his father. He realised that his mother only suffered Mark out of fear and religious loyalty, and he hated her for that, but then looked for her in his future wife and found a woman who would excuse his behaviour all day too. He hates and and loves Wendy because she is his mother. Jack never stopped loving his dad, it just became harder to be proud of it. Danny's middle name is Anthony, signifying an immense respect Jack still holds for his father. Mark is unpredictable and dangerous, a wasp's nest. Wasps' nests are integral to The Shining. There are two of them in the story. The first is seen in flashbacks to Jack's childhood, a wasp's nest that took root in the garden of his childhood home and represents the fallout Jack is still dealing with from being raised by Mark. The second is found in the Overlook Hotel's attic, exactly where Ullman told Jack not to let Danny play, and it represents Jack's budding relationship with Danny, which appears to be veering down the same road as Mark's. They represent the idea of living close to something simultaneously dormant and dangerous, be that nature, construct, or man himself. They represent the kind of person Jack and his father were, hives of violent evil, prone to lashing out at any random opportunity, impossible to control without fighting fire with fire. Finally, they represent the excuses Jack makes for his own behaviour. The first nest we encounter in the narration is the wasp nest on the roof of the Overlook Hotel, which Jack finds whilst changing some roof tiles. Thankfully, it's so cold that the wasps don't crowd out and sting Jack off the side of the roof, so he is able to bug bomb them. Like Jack's abuse, they're dormant, but will begin to muster some energy as their isolation continues. Finding this nest reminds Jack of the wasp nest he kept on his bedside table as a child. This is how he gently introduces his father to the reader, by initially offhandedly mentioning something that seems benign, and later admitting an ordeal that alters the context of those first scenes. Jack's childhood nest informs Jack's experience with the Overlook nest in a way that comes off weirdly at first. He suggests giving Danny the bombed Overlook nest, recalling that he had one on his bedside table as a child. Jack recounts that it smelled of petrol. Jack is occasionally described in a way that makes him feel like a part of nature, untamable, dangerous. When he stands in the park, we're told, the sun was brilliant but held no warmth, which wouldn't normally stand out to me but felt intentionally written about Jack, a son watching his son but holding no warmth. It always seemed slightly perverted to Jack to clip and torture a plain old hedge into something that it wasn't, rousing this idea of Jack as a hedge. Trying to clip him to change him would limit him. He feels close to nature in an odd way, like he's just as untamable. The wasp's nest is perfect for him. Wendy has a gut feeling about the wasp nest. She doesn't want it to be on her son's bedside table. She voices this to Jack, and they compromise by doing what Jack wants. Wasps' nests look eerie. They're all chapped and papery and grey. Some of them have holes depending on the species. They look rotten. They're cool but gross and dangerous, a reminder that nature should be left alone. It's not to be tamed and framed. Ironically, we should not play with fire, or if you are going to play with fire, make sure it's enough to do the job. Jack becomes defensive over this nest. It's almost like he has something to prove. The nest isn't dead. This is either because these are Overlook Hotel wasps, sturdier than their Travelodge counterparts, or because Jack uses a store-bought bug bomb. The nest on his childhood nightstand was rendered passive with gasoline and a lit match, teaching Jack the lesson, fire kills everything. This is a store-bought wasp killer. Man-made. Is the implication that fire beats man? Are store-bought tools weaker than nature? Or is it just that the Overlook Hotel won't let its inhabitants be destroyed so easily? Wendy and Jack awake to the sound of screaming and find Danny stung to smithereens. Jack's fatherhood rears its head again in this scene in two ways. Firstly, he screams at Wendy, "Shut the fuck up and kill them, do what I say," projecting his rage onto the one person in the room he knows knew better than him and who he ignored anyway. Secondly, he asks Wendy, "Are you allergic to stings? Think hard. If you are, Danny might be." This one's laughably indicative of his role. Jack was warned that his family would be out of range of any medical help, and he has never bothered to learn what their allergies were. This is the thing you would want to know before putting a wasp nest by your son's bed. He puts all the responsibility on Wendy in this scene, making it her fault if she didn't speak up. Obviously, we know Wendy would have said if she or Danny had an allergy. This is just a way for Jack to displace the blame. The nest hurts Jack's pride because it reminds him that his authority isn't infallible. He can tell his family that the nest will be fine enough for them to sleep next to, not him, obviously, but that doesn't make it so. It makes Jack look like an idiot. His first instinct is to find someone to sue. He ignores his crying wife, like the narration is clear that he ignores Wendy on purpose, and begins reassuring his son by insisting that they'll sue the pants off the manufacturers. Jack's legal plan here was to plug Wendy's upset with money, buying her forgiveness and displacing the blame onto the manufacturer, anything to avoid admitting a mistake in front of his son. The other nest was a nest that Jack's father procured for him. Having found the nest in the garden of their childhood home, Mark's children watched in horror as he strolled up to it, remarking, "My father showed me this." This wasp's nest harkens to this theme of sins of the father, generational learning. Mark set the leaves under the nest on fire and sat on the porch, chugging beers while it smouldered, Jack playing at his feet. When the wasp nest was rendered dormant, Mark knocked it to the floor. His sons, terrified, fled. Mark swayed and blinked down at the nest, stating, "The smoke makes them drunk, Jackie." As Mark doused the nest in petrol, lit a match and tossed it onto the nest, he told Jack a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Fire will kill anything, giving him the nest for his bedside table. I love the wasp motif in this book because it represents different things to each character. For Mark, the wasp nest appears as an opportunity to educate, but it's to demonstrate his control over a dangerous aspect of nature. His sons fear the nest, and so he gets to swagger around and show off his dominion over the wasps. It's also an opportunity to kill lots of living creatures from a position of righteous protection. For Jack, the nest represents his self-control. He is as insecure about the safety of the nest as he is about his ability to lead and protect. Jack thinks he has control over a dangerous entity. Be that the nest, or his temper, or his alcoholism is beside the point, because his insistence on having any of these things near his son just to prove a point results in Danny being subjected to grave danger. To Jack, the wasp nest represents his eternal victimhood. He bemoans his reality, that his life is one big series of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Everything bad happens to him. All he does is accidentally stick his hand into the nest, hitting George Hatfield, breaking Danny's arm, losing his job. Jack believes himself to be a passive victim of these incidents. He remarks that he had not acted, but had been acted upon, that the nest was a symbol for what he'd been through, describing his fuck-ups as the great wasp's nest of life. He believes he is due a prize for being a reformed man, otherwise he may as well go back to how he was. There's no point otherwise. Although Jack is who he is, the Overlook Hotel takes these traits and exacerbates them tenfold. Jack's embracing of this is symbolised by the Excedrin he buys in Sidewinder, another symptom of an old drinking habit. These pills literally leave a bad taste in his mouth and give him the same bolshiness as a drunk man. Upon popping a few, he decides to call Ullman to poke him in revenge for Ullman airing his dirty laundry in his job interview, i.e. highlighting his concerns about allowing him to work as the winter caretaker with a past drinking problem. Jack antagonises Ullman by threatening to publish a tabloid piece, collecting all the murders and shady happenings in the Overlook's past into one big book that he will sell to make his millions. It's only when he hangs up that he feels guilty, admitting, why had he called Ullman? Jack didn't think he was that petty. It was the kind of thing he'd do when drunk. Jack, you've always been your meanest when you've been sober. Jack does this because he wants the last word against Ullman. Every relationship he has with every character in this book becomes a tally of point scoring, and he always needs to be the one in the lead. He resents Ullman for holding his future in his hands and wants Ullman to feel the same fear. He does this because he thinks that Al Shockley will vouch for him. He is wrong. Al Shockley is the majority shareholder of the Overlook Hotel. If Jack publishes a book that destroys the hotel, Al Shockley loses everything. Unbeknownst to Wendy, Al has offered Jack money to tide him and his family over, but Jack has refused it. He wants to prove that he doesn't need help from his friends, and his family almost pay the ultimate price for this pride. He hates Al for being rich. He considers the job tip charity. Suddenly, he becomes fixated on this Overlook book being his only way back into independent financial stability. Al is a welcome reality check for Jack. Well, he's welcome to me. Jack is furious. When Al asks if getting sober together meant anything, Jack brims with rage. Al delivers as a new detail, one Jack omitted from his narration. Before you hit that Hatfield kid, I had talked the board out of letting you go. You blew that one for yourself. Al may have been his drinking buddy, but Al also helped pick up Jack's pieces. Jack hates Al for this. They never speak to each other again. The second he is pulled up on his reckless behaviour, Jack wonders whether this is National Pick Jack Torrance Apart Week. He mimics Al internally, thinking, of course we're friends, we'll always be friends, and the dog colour I have you on will be ignored by mutual consent. All I ask in return is your soul. He thinks that Al is demanding his soul because Al has asked him not to write a book that would destroy his career. When Jack vacillates, saying, give me your deal and I'll take it, if you want my balls I'll send them, Al sees right through the act, asking, are you sure self-pity is a luxury you can afford, Jack? Jack makes his excuses and leaves, thinking, you've got your pound of flesh and blood and all, now can't can't you leave me alone? Deciding that there will be a reckoning. His own sense of self-respect could only be pushed so far before disintegrating entirely. He would write the book, even if it meant the end of his relationship with Al. He would write the book for the same reason all great literature is written. The truth comes out. He sees this as his duty, but more importantly his path to fame and fortune as the great American writer he is destined to be. Jack is so self-obsessed that he believes he can do whatever he wants, and anyone getting in the way of that is an enemy. His friends are people who support him unconditionally, have the same attitudes as him, and who let him do whatever he wants, however he wants, to whoever he wants. Jack is a foul, abusive man who has exhausted his final chance to atone hundreds of times already, and spends the first half of the novel begging for more final chances, granted them only because his family are ostensibly stranded with him. Jack's moral struggle can only be categorized as such because self-pity is so easily confused for contrition. Jack loves Danny in his own way, but his self-centered attitude forbids him from allowing Danny's needs to come before his own. Wendy notices that Danny tosses and turns in his sleep when they fight. Jack doesn't notice. Wendy notices when Danny climbs into Dick Halloran's car and worries about what she would do if Dick just drives away. Jack doesn't even notice. Wendy wanted to get a phone for the house because of Danny's fainting spells, and Jack resents her when they have the phone but no need to call an ambulance on it. He is more bitter about the cost of the phone than he is concerned about safeguarding his son. Jack later comments that the only thing he owned was his battered old VW Bug, claiming that his wife and son owned everything and he had nothing, and accidentally slips into the narration that they were actually always broke because he always spent his entire paycheck on drinking, usually the day he was paid. Wendy asks if Jack is okay, and he snaps at her so badly that she is visibly upset. He apologizes, blames a headache, and makes a joke about his drinking days. When going to investigate the old lady in the bath in room 217, Wendy begs Jack not to leave, and he calls her stupid. He says, "That's a remarkable imitation of your mother," and he is gleeful when she bursts out crying. This is the cruelest, meanest way he could speak to her, considering he is well aware of her mother, but he does it because it shuts her up, and it's another win by default for Jack, who is keeping his tally for his marriage. He ignores Danny's identical request and shoves Wendy out of the way, like physically shoves her. When he returns and sees that she's been crying, he mentally notes that he likes the sight of her crying. It reminds him that he's not the only scared person, not in a comforting partnership way, but in a competitive way. He doesn't comfort her. He hates that he thinks Wendy sniffs him when they're close to each other, stating he could be off the juice for years and she'd still sniff him at the door to see if he's got alcohol on his breath, which to me indicates that his drinking was so bad that her sniff has become an unconscious thing she does. Why do I think that? Well, because Wendy never comments on it. She never narrates herself sniffing him. She only sometimes comments on how he smells, suggesting that it's either something she does unconsciously or he's just imagining it and she's not doing it. He hates that Wendy comforts Danny when he gets hurt, derisively labeling it the Wendy Torrance all-purpose croon. When Wendy wants to get help in Sidewinder despite the snow, he asks, "Do you think I'm Superman?" She says, "I think you're my husband," and his temper flared. He says, "It's time you got some home truths in you, Wendy. They're knocking around in your head like loose cue balls. We are snowed in." To him, she is a lead weight. Their last moment of being an actual functional family occurs on page 234 when they're pulling each other in the snow on Danny's flexible flyer, which is like this kind of sled. Wendy cries in the kitchen afterwards, scared of being isolated with Jack. But remember, if she leaves, he'll kill himself. Jack doesn't stop drinking because his family want him to stop drinking. It's not the broken arm that stops him drinking. Jack stops drinking after one fateful night out with Al. Al, driving them back from the bar drunk, turned onto the highway and hit a child's bike, which was just in the road. Initially, they both thought that they had killed a child. They climbed out of the car and sobered up while scouring the banks on the side of the road for this kid, but found none. Just a bike in the road. Through some kind of divine intervention, no cops or passers-by came calling. There had been a squib in the paper the next day, a space filler. Jack's wake-up call happens not when he hurts his son, not when he traumatizes his wife, not when he almost loses his job from missing work, not when they're barely scraping by because he's spending all of their money. It happens when he realizes that killing somebody while driving drunk will have consequences. He doesn't care about the effects he's having on his family, only his own future. Like he says he cares, in the narration he's like, "I care a lot," but his actions show that he doesn't care. He doesn't care until it means something for him. Jack and Danny's relationship is exemplified through through the Rogak mallet. Jack explains the Rogak mallet to Danny, neither of them knowing that he will later try to kill Danny with it, which represents the way Jack's fatherhood flips at random between violence and passivity, protection and unpredictable danger, reinforcement and punishment. At one point, Jack looks out from a phone booth and felt a wave of nearly desperate love for the boy. It showed on his face as a stony grimness. Jack does love Danny. We can stretch that definition obviously, because he might feel a tidal wave of love wash over him when he spies his son in the car, but that doesn't change the fact that he left him in the car by himself so that he could go and make a call to Al Shockley, a man he knows Wendy will be furious about him speaking to, bribing Danny with a candy bar that has melted by the time he brings it back to him. Jack's morality is so wound up on itself that you could knit a scarf with it. You can see him as redeemable, especially if you empathize, if you've ever been in the same place as him, and you can see him as a lost cause. You don't owe Jack anything, and if you knew him in person, you also wouldn't owe him anything. You are allowed to sympathize with him from afar without exonerating him. And this formed the crux of the divide between Kubrick and King's renditions of Jack. The former pinned him as an abusive monster, and the latter as a man who deserved another chance. Personally, even having read The Shining, I align with Kubrick more, if it wasn't really obvious. The thing about King is that he writes his fears and he writes himself. His main characters are him, and he's very protective of them. He loves them for all their quirks and all their evil. I believe he thought that Jack was redeemable because King was redeemable. King overcame his rage towards his children and his substance abuse. But I think he struggled to see the forest for the trees. King identifies with Jack. King coped with his thoughts by writing The Shining. Jack didn't cope with his thoughts by writing shit. He just hit his family a lot and got possessed by a hotel. King's family have been explicit that he was never physically abusive, even during active addiction. Jack reflects on a life he considers out of his hands. All his life he'd been trying unsuccessfully to control his temper. He recalls being spanked by a neighbour over some misbehaviour, throwing a rock at a car out of humiliated upset, getting beaten by his dad, and then going and kicking a cat, emphasising how violence is all he's ever known. Jack doesn't understand why his actions are so irredeemable. Through it all, he hadn't felt like a son of a bitch. He was just a really nice guy who was going to have to learn how to control his temper, the same way he was going to have to learn how to cope with his drinking. How you read Jack is dependent on your life experience, and I would not judge you for how you chose to interpret Jack's character. Some people are going to see Jack as a father who is doing his best but struggling under stress and sobriety. Some people are going to see him as a dickhead, and that is just life. Personally, I'm in the latter camp. I appreciate that sobriety can feel impossible and life is a constant struggle, but Jack is a piece of shit to his family, and this pattern of behaviour began before he ever set foot on the threshold of the Overlook Hotel, before he ever really took up drinking. His pattern of behaviour is precisely what brings him to set foot on the threshold of the Overlook, and he never ever learns from it. This interpretation of Jack was also held by director Stanley Kubrick. Despite its acclaim, King hated Kubrick's movie so much that Warner Brothers had to gag him to stop him from slagging it off too publicly. But King believed that Kubrick's interpretation of Jack failed to demonstrate what he believed to be Torrance's nuanced character. He hated the casting of Jack Nicholson for the role. King said the horror in the novel came from the fact that Jack Torrance is a nice guy, not someone who's flown out from the cuckoo's nest. There was no moral struggle at all. Jack spends a lot of time in this book wishing people could see how he's actually secretly a good and capable person. They just need to put their entire faith in him and let him lead, and any failures on his part to meet the expectations he wants them to have is not his fault. He wants to be judged on the actions he thinks he's capable of, not the actual things he does. If he fucks up, if he's nasty, if he's abusive, he thinks it's unfair of you to characterize him as such. You need to understand that he's actually a nice guy. In Rogak's Haunted Heart biography of Stephen King, she recalls the fact that King started to get really sick of seeing his stories interpreted incorrectly, and began to demand more creative control over adaptations of his work. I took that to mean, in the future, we will play it 100% faithfully unless explicitly agreed. So when I came to watch the Shining miniseries, I was quite surprised. No, not just because Jack is played by Steven Weber, i.e. Principal Bolan from 13 Reasons Why. Almost all of Jack's scenes, lines, and decisions have been kind of rewritten, reframed, run through different atmospheres to make him seem more sympathetic. Like, He's obviously written as a man who is possessed, whereas in the book it's a little bit vaguer. He explicitly tells Wendy that he will kill himself if she leaves. Wendy is explicitly written to be a far more confident, autonomous woman. He is obviously written to appear like he's more under control. Instead of lying there dazed and disabled, George Hatfield takes 2 brisk punches to the face, gets up, and runs away relatively unharmed. And unlike in the book, where the zombified Jack manages to overcome the possession just enough to sputter out a croaky "get out" to Danny to get him safe at the Overlook Hotel right at the last second before it blows up, miniseries Jack is briefly pulled from his hypnotism just long enough to hug his boy in a moment of fatherly love before screaming in anguish and running away to blow up the hotel. Maybe this is how King remembers writing Jack, or maybe this is how he initially intended Jack to come across in the book, but Jack miniseries Torrance is nothing like the book's rendition either. Neither The Shining nor Stephen King's The Shining Jack Torrance is depicted anything like he is depicted in the book. King is a prolific author responsible for, at time of writing this script, which is probably like at least a month before the video goes live, he may have put another one out, 65 novels and over 200 short stories, writing several thousand words per day. Across his career, he has spoken a lot about retiring or taking a break, but has never, to my knowledge, dropped his writing output below 1 book or short story collection per year since like 1974. He himself said, "I'm like a drug addict. I'm always saying I'm going to stop, and then I don't. When I'm not working, my mind doesn't take too kindly to being unhooked from its dope." I think writing helps because it's productive, and productivity can often feel like you have things under control. When you write, you can theoretically just keep giving yourself stuff to do, which again makes you feel productive. The only way he could block out his anxieties was by writing, and although King supposed he could make good use of a therapist, decided he didn't want to address the root of his anxiety. Instead, he harnessed it to become one of the most famous horror authors of all time, which I personally kind of admire. He knows he could probably fix it, but made a career off it instead. That's his prerogative. King acknowledged this. Writing is an addiction. The fact that I'm not doing it nags at me. And addiction is the key word, because with the groundwork of his anxieties laid out, we can hazard a guess as to the second of King's coping mechanisms, which he discovered in his teenage years: alcohol and later drugs. King discovered that he possessed an addictive, obsessive personality. From the first sniff, King said, "Cocaine owned me body and soul," and was soon abusing every substance he could find, even Listerine. In retrospect, he admitted, "I was an addictive personality. Period. If it would change your consciousness, I was all for it." Stephen King isn't the only person to have theories as to why. He grew up in some of the most abject poverty I've ever seen described in text, which could have led to struggles with moderation. His father had been absent since the age of 2, which plagued him for many decades. Interestingly, however, King believed he inherited his addictive genetics from his mother, Ruth. His evidence? She would crave the taste of asphalt so much whilst pregnant that she would go out onto the road and peel it up with her bare hands, chewing it like taffy as she walked back into the house. Whatever the reason, he was at the deep end of it all for about 8 years. His friend Rick Hautala remarked that King would knock back 6 to 8 beers while he was drinking his first couple, so unnervingly fast that Rick wondered if Stephen was dumping them on the floor while he wasn't looking. King admits to having driven drunk, resulting in a collision with, thankfully, a traffic cone. He drank more when his mother passed away. He drank more upon the publication of Pet Sematary, a book he never wanted to publish but ended up essentially contractually forced to. He drank when he felt like he was failing as a writer, and he took drugs to write, especially when he was on a roll, so much so that he would have to plug his nostrils with cotton wool as he typed, so that blood wouldn't drip onto his clothes or his paper. Damned if you do, damned if you don't, and damn, he was quite high. King wrote Jack and his alcoholism from a point of view that was ironically self-aware and also in denial. Like, he wouldn't get the wake-up call to get sober for another 10 years. He was still in the "I can quit anytime I want" phase, but his immersion in high-functioning addiction gave him a unique perspective. King's wife, Tabby, put this best when discussing the moment that King decided to get clean. The worst side effect of addiction is the inability to see what you're doing to yourself and others. I made Stephen acknowledge that, and then he decided to save himself. No matter how many times she found him passed out in a pool of his own vomit, no matter the fact that he had to buy a second apartment just to live in during the times that Tabby would kick him out, no matter the bumps and bruises he got while driving home, it was the awareness that his addiction was causing issues for others that made him willing to stop. Jack befriended Al, the alcohol and the man, during school events, as they were always the 2 drunkest people there. Shockley had separated from his wife, and Jack's marriage was skidding slowly downhill. It became an issue for his young family when he got his first story published in the magazine Esquire. He had his students over at his house with a keg to celebrate. He went out for a quick one, only to stumble in at dawn and then drop Danny, a baby at the time, on the floor. Jack blames many circumstances, people, and places for his alcoholism and his violence, and who or what he blames changes across the story as the hotel takes hold. Sometimes he felt like his drinking problem stemmed from a desire to be free of Stovington, the security of the job stifling his creative urge. Sometimes he blamed it on Wendy because she nagged him when she asked him when he planned to be home. Ultimately, when the possession of the hotel takes hold and he finds himself fully erect, suddenly dancing in the arms of a gorgeous woman, he concludes, incidents seem to have occurred with no connections, here, there, and everywhere. In Haunted Heart and on writing, Rogak and King recount the 1999 traffic accident King was involved in. Well, I say traffic accident. King used to take daily walks, which involved walking along the side of a stretch of road. One normal day, he was walking along that road when a van hit him. The driver, Brian Smith, was under the influence, as he had a record of being. Looking back on it, King remarked, "I had almost been killed by a character out of one of my own novels," which I always found a curious way of phrasing it. Not only had King himself been behind the wheel whilst drunk in the past, although his only known casualties were traffic cones, he had written this exact scene 2 decades prior, only instead of a child's bike, it was him. He had almost been hit by Jack Torrance. I think King defends Jack because he thinks he is Jack. I think that's why he didn't like Kubrick's movie, and I think that's why he went on to write Dr. Sleep, the sequel, which I won't spoil, but I do plan to cover imminently. Dr. Sleep especially felt like a way to get the last word in on a topic King clearly rejects any wiggle room on. Yet, while Jack does represent a bad part of King, it's a bad part of him he has overcome and left behind decades ago. The thing about King is, when the going got tough, he changed. It was really hard, but he overcame it, mainly through writing. His relationships improved and he worked through it. But there's this part of him that still identifies with Jack Torrance, because he's been there. The broken promises, the mistakes, the bad stuff. The difference between them, however, is that King had the strength to change, and Jack Torrance did not. Torrance is the King he left behind, burned to cinders within the Overlook Hotel.